So, hello and welcome back yet again to the Christine is getting very far ahead, and that's probably a very good thing. I hope, I hope everybody isn't getting too confused if they go to the playlist page and see all of the unavailable videos. Don't worry, they will all become available as, the proper evening comes for each of them. It just, I really didn't want to leave you guys with nothing to listen to because, darn it, I've kept this schedule up for 3 years now, and I would hate to, drop it. That would make me feel terrible. So, as a result, I'm getting everything done ahead of time so that I have a decent recovery time. And if I don't need it, well, then I'm just way ahead. And that's kind of a good thing, too. So, anyway, I hope you guys are all doing good. I am on video number 3 today. I would probably be able to do even more of these, except for the fact that, I do like to get up and do some other things every once in a while. And I have to give my voice a chance to recover in between each reading session because, well, Ms. Pierce's books are usually reasonably long chapters, anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes. Uh, Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory seem to be the masters of how long can we make each chapter. So I usually need to recover from reading after an hour and a half to 2 hours a chapter. It's cool though. Anyway, when we left Kel, she she fought a centaur and rescued a little girl, and seems to have also inadvertently rescued a baby griffin who evidently, if a parent griffin smells that you have even touched their baby, it sounds like you die a very painful, very messy death. So Kel now has to figure out how to return this baby griffin and survive. I think her best bet's going to be to maybe see if she can get in touch with Dane, because we do know at least Dane can communicate with the immortals, but gee, that sounds like fun? Question mark. I mean, you see griffins in fantasy paintings and you're like, oh, they look so cool. How majestic. But yeah, I could definitely see they would not be the friendliest of all creatures. So, anyway, we're going to jump back in and we are going to see what is happening in the book Squire by Tamora Pierce with Chapter 5, The Griffin. Kels sat bolt upright with a gasp. In her dream, the centaur had come to life again, scaring her out of sleep. She was in the dark, cased with sun-dried cotton that had a fishy scent. She was not hot, sweating, dirty, or in pain, and now she remembered. They had lifted her up the hill on a loading platform and brought her to the makeshift hospital. She had warned them about the griffin before someone else could touch it, and a healer had told her that she had broken bones and then given her some vile-tasting powder that had put her to sleep. She was in the hospital now, and it was night, and there were a few oil lamps supplying the only light. She was just wondering how the others had done when the healer brought her another dose of medicine. After that, she slept well into daylight until she woke alert and ravenous. Someone had put a metal cage beside her cot, and inside of it was the pouch, the griffin, a dish of water, and a dish of what smelled like fish scraps. If the immortal had eaten, she couldn't tell. They must have just stuck the pouch in the cage and let the griffin crawl out, she thought with a yawn. She could see the small gate in the side closest to the dishes. Whoever had fed the griffin and given it water could just change the dishes that way. If the griffin didn't mind the cage, then maybe Kel could transport him in it until she found his parents. Her hands throbbed from the mauling that they had taken from those claws, and Kel would rather not let it have any more of her blood if she could help it. A woman brought Kel a bowl of broth. "The bandits?" said Kel, forgetting what she had been told. "Captured. Them that aren't dead," the woman said. "They'll face the Crown's justice soon enough." Kel nodded and then finished her broth. Within a few moments of handing the bowl to the woman, she was asleep again. It was almost sunset when the baby griffin's squalling roused Kel. She peered at him over the edge of the cot. He was flapping half-opened wings, objecting to the cage. When he saw Kel, he peered up at her through the openings in the metal. Kel flopped onto her back. I wanted that to be a dream, she thought. Another woman brought Kel water and a bowl of noodles in broth. Kel was so hungry she almost inhaled the food, looking around as she ate. She counted 20 beds, most filled with sleeping men. The two beside Kel held female riders. She was about to put her bowl on the floor when something small and wet hit her cheek. She wiped it off and then inspected it. A ragged bit of fish skin. With a frown, Kel wiped it onto a napkin and put the bowl next to her cot. When she straightened up, something wet stuck in her eye. Kel pulled it out. More fish skin. She looked into the cage. "Stop it," she told the griffin. She was impressed with the little thing's aim. It must have taken either innate skill or lots of practice. Inspection of her blankets revealed pieces of scaled skin and fish bones in all of the wrinkles. Kel touched her pillow and the sheets around her head to find more samples of the griffin's target practice. She leaned over and glared at the creature. And a large smelly bit hit her squarely in the mouth. Kel picked it off with a grimace and dropped it into the cage. The griffin bowed its shoulders, lifted its head, and opened its beak, and then spread and fluttered its wings. Kel had raised young strays, and she knew begging when she saw it. "Ridiculous," she told the griffin. "You've been feeding yourself from your dish. Keep on feeding yourself." She lay down with a thump, and a gobbet of fish entrails landed in her ear. She sat upright with a cry of disgust, wrenched off her blanket, and tossed it over the griffin's cage. The griffin began to shriek. Even with the blanket to muffle it, the hall was echoing. Seeing the other patients sitting up, Kel grabbed the blanket off the cage, and the griffin opened its beak and fluttered its wings. Kel lifted the cage onto her lap. "Little monster," she growled. She opened the grate and she reached for the dish, and the griffin lunged and clamped its beak on the tip of her index finger. Kel bit her tongue to keep from waking anyone with a scream and fought the griffin for possession of her finger. The moment she shook it off, the griffin assumed the begging position again. Kel glared. Her charge was still filthy, shedding feathers. Its keel bone was stark against the skin of its chest, and it was definitely half-starved. Keeping a watchful eye on it, she took a fish off the plate, and the griffin opened its beak and tilted its head back. Kel let the fish drop, and in 3 bites the prize was gone, and once again the griffin begged. Kel fed it 2 more fish without a problem. When she fumbled getting the next out of the cage, the griffin hissed and swiped at her arm, leaving deep scratches. "I guess you've had enough," said Kel. She closed the cage and put it on the floor, and the griffin began to scream again. 5 fish, a bitten finger, and 3 more scratches later, the griffin stopped begging. It closed its eyes and fell asleep in its cage, and this time when Kel put it on the floor, it didn't protest. She was still picking fish remains off of her bed when the nurses came in to light the lamps, and with them came the shepherd's boy, Bernin. "You look better," he told Kel frankly, parking his behind on a stool next to her cot. "You was green when they brung you up." "I'm not surprised," said Kel. "I felt green." Her ribs and her leg were bruised, but the deep ache was gone. The vile liquid must have been healing potion. "The mayor didn't even want you here 'cause of that." Bernin pointed at the griffin. "M'lord roared at him and the mayor changed his mind." He grinned, and Kel had to grin back. "I would do what my lord said if he roared at me," she told him. "Well, you got to, being his squire and all. That little one you saved? The little girl?" "Jump saved her," said Kel. "I distracted the centaur." Jump, who was asleep in the opposite corner of her cot away from the griffin, thumped the floor with his tail. Vernon rolled his eyes at this city girl nitpicking. "Anyways, her folks is charcoal burners, caught in the woods by them bandits. They took a bunch of lone folk, them that only come into the walls for winter. Cowardly pukes." He spit on the floor, getting a disapproving glare from a healer. "But the Littlands family wants to show you gratitude. They want to know what they can do." Kel winced. She had done nothing to be thanked for. Jump had saved the child. All she had done was kill the centaur and almost gotten killed herself because she had forgotten that he had been part horse. Any thanks would only grind it in that it was a miracle any of them were alive. "If they want to give Jump a bone, or thank Captain Flyden, who put me there, that's fine," she said. "I just did what I was told." "Don't you want to be thanked?" said Vernon. "Isn't that what you go heroing for?" "No," said Kel. Remembering her manners, she added, "Say that I thank them for thinking of me." Vernon wandered off, shaking his head. He passed Raoul on the way out, and Kel watched her nightmaster walk along the rows of beds, talking with those who were awake. Hers was the last bed he reached. For a moment, he looked at her, hands in his pockets, shaking his head. "Young idiot," he said, amusement in his eyes. "You forgot the forelegs, didn't you?" Kel smiled. "Yes, sir." "You'll remember next time." He spotted Vernon's stool, and he lowered himself onto it. It was so short that his knees were at the same level as his chest. He straightened his legs with a sigh. "It was a pretty trap, though. The rope was a nice touch." "I got lucky," said Kel. "If he had fallen wrong, the child would have died, or my friend over there." She nodded at the griffin's cage. "You can if yourself to death, Squire," said Raoul. "I would advise against it. You're better off getting extra sleep. Once you and the others are up and about, we have to take these charmers to the magistrates for a trial." He grinned as Kel made a face. "When people say a night's job is all glory, I laugh and laugh and laugh," he told her. "Often I can stop laughing before they edge away and talk about getting me a soothing drink." As for the griffin, he looked at the cage and sighed. "I'm surprised he's still in there. Griffins usually don't put up with cages for long. We heard testimony from the robbers that we captured. They knew about the griffin, of course. The centaur killed the peddler who stole it from the parents. Did they teach you about griffin parents killing anyone who's handled their young?" Kel nodded. "Until we find them, I'm sure the own can protect you long enough that we can explain things, and I've sent for Dane. she can search for his family. Kel sighed with relief. She thought she might have to leave Lord Raoul's service and work in the palace until the Griffin's parents were found. Well, then I can go on tending it, I guess, she said, not looking forward to that beak and those claws. Raoul just grinned. Think of it as a learning experience, Kel. I would suggest, though, that you get a pair of heavy gloves like the ones the falconers use. Now sleep. I expect you to be walking around tomorrow morning. In her dream, Kel faced Joran of Stone Mountain, Vincent of Genlith, and Garvey of Runner Spring, the senior pages who had been her greatest enemies in the palace. They had made her first 2 years as a page into a running battle with first Kel, who could not stand by while others were bullied, and then with Kel and her friends. Vincent had even attacked Kel's maid Lassa. Once they became squires, with knight masters to answer to, Garvey and Vincent seemed to lose interest, and Joran changed as well. He claimed he had seen the error of his ways and that he wanted to be friends. Although she rarely saw them, Kel still dreamed of them, and they were still her foes. In this dream, Joran, white blonde, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, the prettiest man Kel had ever seen, grabbed Kel's left ear between his thumb and finger, and with a smile pinched Kel's ear hard, fingernails biting through cartilage. Kel sat up and yelled. Her dream vision of the squires vanished, but the pain in her ear went on. She grabbed for it and caught a mass of feathers and claws that scored her hands. The Griffin had gotten out of his cage, climbed onto Kel's bed, and had buried its beak in her ear. She tugged at him, and that made the pain worse. She stopped, gasping, and tried to clear her mind. It was hard to do. The monster growled in its throat, distracting her, as did the complaints from the other patients. Breathing slow, trying to forget the pain and the distractions, Kel found the hinges of its beak and pressed them. Her fingers slipped in her own blood, and it took several tries till she could apply enough pressure to make the Griffin let go. The minute it did, Kel wrapped both hands around it and stuffed it under her blankets, rolling it up. Then she grabbed the cage. And it fell apart in her hands. Only a handful of metal strips, badly rusted, and a pile of rusty flakes remained. The dishes that had held the Griffin's water and fish were whole. They were clay. Griffins don't like cages, she muttered. Well, that's not how I would have put that. One of the nurses rushed in with a plate of fish and thrust it at Kel. The moment Kel took it, the woman fled. Kel got to her feet. Someone had laid fresh clothes on the stool next to her cot. Using her nightshirt as a protective tent, Kel got dressed under it, muttering curses on Griffins as she tried to keep the blood off of her clothes. When she shed the nightshirt, she found a healer standing there. The woman was carrying a tray that held swabs, a bowl of water, cloths, and a bottle of dark green fluid. Kel peeled away enough of the blankets to free the Griffin's head while the rest of it was still wrapped. As she fed it, the healer worked on Kel's ear. When the Griffin lost interest in fish and closed its beak, Kel put the plate aside and glared at it. What was she supposed to do without a cage? She certainly could not leave it wrapped in sheets. As if to prove that point, the Griffin wavered, blinked, and then vomited half-digested fish onto Kel's bedding. Mutely, the healer gave Kel a washcloth and left. Kel used the cloth to clean up the worst of the vomit. The Griffin wrestled one of its paws free and swiped 4 sharp claws over Kel's hand. She was trying to think of a merciful way to kill the beast when a muffled blatting sound issued from the blankets, and a billow of stench rose from her cot. Knowing what she was going to find, Kel pulled the bedding apart. The griffin clambered out of a puddle of half-liquid dung and threw itself at Kel. When she raised her hands in self-defense, it seized one arm, clutching it with its forepaws, and shredded her sleeve as it clawed the underside of her arm. Kel gritted her teeth, shook her pillow free of its case, and shoved the kicking beast inside. The healer returned. "I'd better leave this with you." She placed a fresh bottle of green liquid on the stool. "It will clean your wounds and stop your bleeding." Kel yanked her captive arm free, and she closed her hand around the neck of the pillowcase. The thin cloth would hold her little monster only for a short time. "If I might have some swabs and light oil and warm water, I would be in your debt," she said, one-handedly folding her bedding around the griffin's spectacular mess. "I need to clean my friend here." "Might I recommend the horse trough outside?" the healer said, being as polite as Kel. I will bring everything to you there." The glove idea failed. Kel tried falconer's gloves, riding gloves, even linen bandages on her hands. The griffin would not take food from a gloved hand, and now that Kel was better, it took food from no one else. With regular practice, Kel's skill at incurring only small wounds did improve. She hoped that with more practice, combining her duties as a squire with multiple feedings of her charge would leave her a bit less exhausted at the end of the day. And most of all, she hoped that the griffin's parents came soon. There were 2 of them to care for their offspring. Surely they were never overwhelmed. 5 days after leaving her cot, 3rd Company and the 2 rider groups took to the road with the griffin and 30-odd prisoners. Their destination was the magistrate's court in Irontown. The journey was tense. Everyone knew that death sentences awaited most of the bandits, who almost made daily escape attempts. Twice, the company was attacked by families and friends of the captives trying to set them free. The Haresfield renegade, Markham, was the first one to see the Irontown magistrates. In his case, the Crown asked for clemency, since Markham's information had led to the band's capture. His friend Griffin, who faced the noose, testified that Markham was a reluctant thief who had killed no one. The magistrates gave Markham a choice: 10 years in the army or the granite quarries in the north. He picked the army. Kel went to the trials as Raoul's squire, watching as the bandits' victims and the soldiers, including her knight master, all gave testimony. She heard the griffin's history for herself. The centaur that she had killed, Wind Teeth, had murdered a human peddler who offered griffin feathers for sale. Once he had seen the man had a real griffin in his cart. Wind Teeth knew the risk that he took keeping a young griffin, but the prospect of future wealth had meant more to him. "Nobody went near him after that," said Wind Teeth's brother to the courts. "Nobody wants to tangle with griffins, and that little monster has sharp claws." Not to mention a sharp beak, thought Kel, looking down at her hands. Her right little finger was in a splint, awaiting a healer's attention. The griffin had broken it that morning. Why couldn't she have just left the cursed pouch alone? The court reached its verdicts with no surprises, ruling on hanging for the human robbers and beheading for the centaurs. Kel put on her most emotionless Yamini lump face and attended the executions with Raoul, Captain Flindon, and Commander Bury. She had seen worse. The Yamini Emperor had once ordered the beheading of 40 guards, but she hadn't seen much worse. Looking at the crowds as they gathered for the hangings, she wondered if there was something wrong with her. Many of the people were acting as though this were a party. They brought lunches or purchased food and drink from vendors. They hoisted children onto their shoulders for a better look. They brought or bought printed ballads about the bandits and then sang them. Didn't they care that someone's life was ending? Kel's jaws ached at the end of the day. She had been clenching them so hard, and for the first time in years, she felt like an alien in her own homeland. Then she realized that the three human commanders were not merry either. They ate together both nights after the executions, with Kel waiting on them, and their evenings were spent in review of the hunt and in plans for better ways to do things in the future, not in having fun at the expense of the dead. The second night, Bury followed Kel as she took away the dirty plates and stopped her in the hall outside the supper room. "We do what we must," she told Kel. "We don't enjoy it. Remember the victims if it gets too sickening." "Do you get used to it, Commander?" said Kel. "Call me Bury. Get used to it? Never. There would be something wrong with you if you did," said Bury. "Death, even for someone who is just plain bad, solves nothing. The law says that it's lesser wrong than letting them go kill again, but it sows bitterness in the surviving family and friends. Bitterness that we will reap down the road." "Do the Khmer execute criminals?" Kel asked. Bury's smile was crooked. "In a way," she said. "We give them to the families of those that they've wronged, and the families kill them. After all these years in the civilized West, I'm still trying to decide if that's a better way or not." Kel thought about Mare's gift, fighting his bonds wildly and screaming curses as they had brought him to the headsman, and she couldn't decide either. The only good thing about the execution was that that one had been the last. The next morning, Vera Ladine Sarasiri, known as Dane the Wild Mage, came to Irontown searching for Kel and the Griffin. She found them with Third Company and the rider groups in the barracks at Fort Irontown. "Let's have a look outside," said Dane, looking queasily at the walls. "I've been spying in falcon shape, and this feels a little bit too much like the Muse." Kel retrieved the Griffin and carried him outside, where Raoul and Dane were sitting on a bench in the shade. As Kel approached with the Griffin in his battered leather pouch, she heard Dane say, "No, just for a couple of weeks, but it was enough. I'm afraid that I freed every hawk that was there." She smiled at Kel and held her hands for the pouch. "And this must be as thankless for you as it can get." Kel held the pouch, worried a little. Its parents?" she said. Dane smiled, her blue-green eyes looking mischievous. "Unlike you, I can talk to them and they'll understand me," she told Kel. "Now let's have a look." She lifted the Griffin out of the pouch, gripping its forepaws in one hand and its hind in the other. Once it was in the open, she handled it deftly, checking its rear end, opening its wings to feel the bones, prying open the snapping beak to look into its throat. Kel and Raoul watched in awe. From time to time, the immortal landed a scratch or a bite, but not very often. "We tried keeping him in a cage at first," said Kel. "The metal rusts to nothing overnight, and he rips through straw and cloth." "No, metal's no good," said Dane. "They learn how to age it young. Even a baby like this can break down an average cage overnight once they have the knack. You don't really need a cage. He'll stay with you now that you've hand-fed him." "Oh, splendid," said Kel. "If only I had known." Dane went on. "Make him a platform to sit on, or get him a carrier like they have for the dogs. He should exercise his wings. She bounced the griffin up and down in the air, and instinctively he flapped his wings, scattering dander and loose feathers. Do it like that. He's got to build them up in order to fly. She inspected the griffin's eyes. You don't have to feed him only fish. Other kinds of meat won't kill him, and I know fresh fish is hard to come by. He can have smoked fish and meat. He can even have jerky. She held the immortal up in front of her face. Kel was fascinated to see Dane's brisk treatment produce a code youngster. The griffin didn't even try to scratch her now, but he stared at her as though he had never seen anything like her. Yes, jerky's good, said Dane. He can chew on that instead of you. It's a he, said Raoul. He was fascinated, and Jump sat by his feet as attentive as Raoul was. Dane nodded and opened the griffin's hind legs, pointing to bulges at the base of his belly. Just like cats, she said, as the griffin squalled. She tugged fish skin off of one of his feet before letting his legs close again. Keeping him clean is no fun, said Kel. At least he looked better than he had in Owl's Hollow. It had meant several days' work with diluted soap, oil, and balls of cotton, as well as about a pint of her blood lost to scratches and bites, but it had been worth it. The grease clumps were gone, and his feathers were now bright orange instead of muddy orange-brown. Dane looked at Kel's tattered sleeves and hands. I'll show you how to trim his claws so he doesn't do as much damage. Easier said than done, said Raoul. Dane just laughed. You've done well by him, and it's a thankless job. I can see that he was hungry for a time, but he's gaining weight at last. Kel shrugged. He's a vicious little brute, she muttered. I bet you are, just like the rest of your kind, Dane told the griffin. Preen his feathers with your fingers. That helps shake loose the dander. And I know you're aware of this, but don't get too fond of him, Kel. He's not like this lad. She poked at Jump with a foot. He pounded dust from the ground with his tail. As Dane said, he belongs with the other griffins. You can't take him? Said Kel. Really, he's too much for me. I can't even ask for anyone to help me. If you could, said Raoul. Dane shook her head. He's fixed on Kel. He won't take food from anyone else until he's with his true parents again. I could try all the same, but I'll be on the move, looking for the parents besides whatever else the king asks of me. And I can't talk to him and make him understand things. He's much too young. She plucked a 2-inch feather that was sticking out at a right angle, and the griffin snapped at her, but Dane pulled back out of reach. You have to be quicker than that, she told him. To Kel and Raoul, she said, I know caring for a griffin is hard, and I'm sorry. He'll calm down as he gets used to you, and with any luck, we'll find his family soon. She looked at Kel. Don't even name him if you can help it. I know, said Kel. It's easier to let go if I don't name him. Not that I'll be sorry to see him go, but still. Dane thrust the feather into her curly hair and gripped the griffin by his paws again, turning him onto its back on her lap. As he struggled and squawked, she took a tiny knife from her boot top and unsheathed it. Here's how you trim the claws. Not long after Dane left, Raoul took third company back into the royal forest. In those weeks, Kel met the charcoal burners, the freshwater fishermen, the hunters, the miners, and hermits, who eked out a life in this wild part of the kingdom. She also met more immortals than she had ever seen as a page. Centaurs, including Greystreak and his herd, an ogre clan working a mine, winged horses large and small, a basilisk mother and her son, a herd of unicorns, and even a small tribe of winged apes. This was not a tour, however. They captured almost 20 robbers, burned the nests of 3 spiderins, and killed 9 Huroks and out of a band of 13. The rest fled. Dom showed her a griffin's nest. The parents and the yearling watched them from high in the trees, but there was no sign of that year's chicks. Dane had gone there on the very same day that she had examined the griffin, and had returned at nightfall to say that these griffins knew exactly where their current chick was, and they had not heard of anyone missing a child. Strangest of all was going to a stormwing eyrie. Kel watched the immortals circling their home, sunlight flashing off their feathered steel wings. How did they live when there were no battles? Had they been overhead at Owl's Hollow? Did they come after the fight to rip at the dead? Kel was ashamed to realize that she didn't want to ask. Surely a squire ought to be tough-minded enough to deal with the desecration of a few corpses. Next year, a part of her whispered. We made it through those executions. We watched. Next year will be tough, and then we can ask about Stormwings. We're giving them a chance, said Raoul as they watched the immortals. They don't bother us, we don't bother them, but I'll never trust them. Not after Port Lagan. Then someone called him away, and that night, once supper was done, Kel asked her night master, what happened with Stormwings at Port Lagan? Raoul told his part of the story of the fight for Tortle's third richest city during the Immortals' War. When he was done, Flynn, Kasim, and some of the other veterans told their versions. Kel had seen the battle as movements of armies on a model the King and Dane had used in Lord Wilden's strategy class, but now she heard what the men on the ground had seen. Their maps were sticks and stones and lines on the earth. On other nights, other battles were discussed, giving Kel and the junior members of Third Company an idea of the many aspects of war. There were few amenities during this sweep. They often stayed in villages, hunting for meat and adding their supplies so that the inhabitants didn't suffer with the extra mouths to feed. They paid women to launder and mend their clothes, and baths were still cold. Kel had gotten hot baths in Irontown, but there were few villages big enough for a bathhouse. Most people made do with tubs in their own homes. Kel's guardianship of the baby griffin improved once she made leather sleeves to protect her arms from the wrist to the shoulders. Some accidents resulted when the griffin found that he could hook his rear paws through the laced openings between the upper and lower guards and dig at her elbows, but Kel got better at blocking him. Her hands were still vulnerable, though, and over time she ended up with scars on every finger. And that is the end of that chapter. And oh my goodness, I thought caring for baby, like, eyes not open yet kittens was a round-the-clock job that can be kind of a nightmare at times, but rewarding. But boy, am I glad I don't have a baby griffin, because that sounds horrible. I mean, it also sounds adorable. It just reminds me of the baby raccoons that I see every summer. Very, very cute to watch from a distance, but you know that taking care of them would be a pain. Which is why I'm glad that the mom came back for her baby the next day after leaving it on my deck all day. I think I just laugh and say that that raccoon just knew I was a good babysitter. Anyway, enough of that. Thank you, as always, for listening. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you next time.